So this is the second episode on my reflections and commentary on the Magna Carta. Last time I left off with clause number 5. I'm going to continue now with clause 6. Now I won't go into the history of this Magna Carta again. That was something for the first episode. But we're going to get right back into this now. Heirs shall be married without disparagement. That's the title, and the body is heirs shall be married without disparagement. A rather straightforward clause, keeping in mind here that we're talking about a principled class of English society in the 13th century that are wishing to separate themselves to a degree from the monarch, from the king. This clause would seem to imply that there was a significant intrusion on the marrying of heirs, especially of the noble birth. And just for a moment, I don't want to spend too much time on this, considering the word disparagement, to belittle, to look down upon. I have to ask, well, what are the potential consequences of a monarch that is getting involved in the marrying or intermarrying of the nobility? Of course, the king has his influence if he disparages one person versus another. This influence can lead to the reorganization of that noble class of people. If the king decides to marry off one person of a certain rank to a person that is of lower rank, that'll necessarily reduce the power of that family, alter economic and political interests. And given that the ecclesiastical authority was interwoven at times with the nobility and with the king, there are many strong interplaying factors within a society that could be greatly affected by one action of disparagement, a ripple effect throughout the whole. Clause 7. A widow shall have her marriage, inheritance, and quarantine, the king's widow, etc. So this one's a little long. It's about 6 subclauses. So here we go. A widow, after the death of her husband, incontinent, and without any difficulty, shall have her marriage and her inheritance. Subclause 2. And shall have nothing for her dower, her marriage, or her inheritance, which her husband and she held the day of the death of her husband. 3. And she shall tarry in the chief house of her husband by 40 days after the death of her husband, within which days her dower shall be assigned her, if it were not assigned her before, or that the house be a castle. 4. And if she depart from the castle, then a competent house shall be forthwith provided for her, in the which she may honestly dwell until her dower be assigned, as it is aforesaid. And she shall have in the meantime her reasonable estovers of the common. 5. And for her dower shall be assigned unto her the third part of all the lands of her husband, which were his during coverture, except she were endowed of less at the church door. 6. No widow shall be distrained to marry herself. Nevertheless, she shall find surety, that she shall not marry without our license and assent, if she hold of us, nor without any assent of the Lord, if she hold of another. So let's begin with the interpretation of the first part, or the first subclause of this clause. A widow, after the death of her husband, incontinent, and without difficulty, shall have her marriage and her inheritance. So there's a couple of things about this first part here. Incontinent in this context means that she should have her inheritance and the marriage without delay. Now when it says, she shall have her marriage, at the first instant I was unsure about what exactly that referred to or what it meant. But I think it refers to the idea of remarrying if she were to choose so immediately. Now, much like all of these clauses, what I want to keep in mind is the broad context that the nobles are securing for themselves certain things. In the previous, we talked about heirs to be married. The one before that, we talked about guardianship and the passing down of an estate to a minor. All of this is getting into more of the intricate details, I think, of how the nobles saw their relationship to the king, what they were dissatisfied with, the areas of their lives that the authority of the king penetrated. And here in the marriage of a woman after her death, we can imagine of the noble classes, if a woman's husband were to die, she would inherit everything that he owned. And if it was a substantial estate, I think one can imagine that a king might want to use this for his own, perhaps his own property, or he would want to secure the power that is wound up within a marriage to a man that is subordinate and adherent to his wills and desires, not somebody who's rebellious and says things contrary to the monarch. So keeping this again, all of these little points being these humming background identifiers about where we are, where that relationship is between the nobility and the king. So the second subclause, and shall give nothing for her dower, her marriage, or her inheritance, which her husband and she held the day of the death of her husband. So saying that it's possible that when her husband dies, maybe the king would hold for ransom her inheritance, that she would have to give part of her inheritance, if not all of it, to the king. To the top of mind, hereditary succession, independence of the nobles in this regard. Now, a dower is something that is inherited, a widower's inheritance. Subclause 3, and she shall tarry in the chief house of her husband by 40 days after the death of her husband, within which days her dower shall be assigned her, if it were not assigned her before, or that the house be a castle. So here my attention is drawn to the 40 days. Exactly why she has to tarry in the chief house of her husband by 40 days after the death of her husband, I'm not sure. Perhaps it is to make sure that she's actually in the principal property, that she's not taken away from it, that it cannot be altered or changed in some way. Or, what's most probable is that 40 days is a reference to the book of Numbers, and the experience of the Israelites that spent 40 years in the desert because of their hesitation to enter the promised land because of fear and doubting God's promise. And I think about, if we're really trying to consider a reason for this 40, so it's not an arbitrary number, I think about the significance, the suffering of those Israelites, the necessity for time to pass, for the older generation to pass, so that the newer generation can find within themselves the fire to make a change of their destitute condition and want better for their people, for their society. And it sort of marks a transitionary period. The death of the old, the birth of a new. And perhaps in the case of a widow, it is the consolation that moving through the process of grief, truly laying to rest her husband so that she may be ready for something new. She buries that part of herself with him. Within which days her dower shall be assigned her, if it were not assigned to her before. Now it's interesting that they're leaving open the possibility of 40 days until the inheritance coming down to her, whereas in the first clause it's saying a widow after the death of her husband incontinent without delay and without difficulty shall have her marriage and her inheritance. So perhaps, again, that 40 days is really symbolic and purposefully trying to prompt that type of healing or grieving experience and transformation of the widow, so she doesn't make rash decisions. The thing I wonder about here is, within that 40 days, where is the inheritance? I mean, does anybody hold it? Surely it's bound by law. The land is still bound under the king's authority, after all. So I wonder, effectively, if it just goes to the king's, under the king's guardianship, or perhaps of a noble of higher rank. It's hard to say exactly how that would have worked out. Within which days her dower shall be assigned to her, if it were not assigned her before, or that the house be a castle. Now why this last part here, or the house be a castle? Now possibly this is added because a castle is a strategic military asset. 40 days may not be practical, especially in the case of an emergency. There may be expediency required there. Subclause 4, and if she depart from the castle, then a competent house shall be forthwith provided for her, in which she may honestly dwell until her dower be assigned to her, as it is aforesaid. And she shall have in the meantime her reasonable estovers of the common. So this addition here, I also think is kind of interesting. That it's saying, for whatever reason, if she were to leave, and there's this, I get this sense that there is an urgency, there's an implication that the castle is quite a unique situation over just a basic manor, some amount of land that this person will inherit. It seems, either by that first hypothesis, that this is a matter of expediency because of military affairs, or possibly that it's not a suitable living quarters for a widow of a noble person a noble man. And we can think about it in two senses. One, in the sense that she is forcefully removed from the castle. And I wonder here, a castle more so than landed property would have the eye, the power, the vigor of the king behind, such that his authority probably extended to those military complexes much more ardently, much more strictly. And it's possible because of that relationship that this woman would be removed from the castle. Now, if she leaves willfully, then it might again just be because of that situation in which she is not fit to live in a castle. And again, because of the purpose, not because of the largeness of the building or the prestige that it holds, which in and of itself is lofty. And if she depart from the castle, then a competent house shall be forthwith provided for her. So maybe you have another noble, somebody in her family. Perhaps this is to be supplied by the king at the king's expense. In the history of England, even after King John, the relationship between the nobles and the king is always often fraught with difficulties. Passions can rise to the height of wars, civil wars. The nobles and barons can be quite rebellious and quite outlandish in their requirements of their rights or liberties from the king's purse of prerogative. And I say that because in the case that a competent house be provided by the king, I think that would be one of those, especially at this time, a difficult thing to get through. To want that sort of thing from the king's possession. Even from my standpoint, it seems like, well, that's in the king's domain. He can give you the right to have this, or secure, perhaps, that she goes to a good place, wherever he may find it, among family or another noble, whatever. But to ask of him, out of his expense, is quite bold. In which she may honestly dwell until her dower be assigned to her, so that 40 days, or within the 40 days. And she shall have in the meantime her reasonable estovers of the common. So estovers, what does that mean? So this definition is from Google. In English law, estovers is an allowance made to a person for their support, such as an allowance of wood for a tenant or alimony for a spouse. Now, with specific regard to the right to gather wood, it refers to the right to gather wood from common land for use of firewood or for other purposes. This right is called a common of estovers and is important for tenants who need resources to maintain their lands and homes. The wood can be gathered for a variety of purposes, including repairing a house, making or repairing agricultural tools, repairing fences. Now, just as a side comment, if anybody is a outdoors enthusiast or a camping enthusiast, one will understand how much wood is actually necessary to stay warm, especially in the winter months, and how quickly firewood can be expended for that purpose, and that it would require quite a lot of wood to maintain a warm living environment. So it's not a complex step to take, to find reason in the general sense of the matter, considering this fourth subclause, or just the seventh clause in general that we're on, that all of these indications, all of these privileges that are being secured by law, written down so that they can have some force of reference, it is securing the safety of people within a particular class. A widow shall have her marriage, inheritance, and quarantine. The king's widow. So on the mind, I think we should continually be considering these securities, however trivial they may seem to us. They are all important nodes or pieces of information that provides us how the barons at the time felt that they ought to be related to the sovereign, to the king. And for her dower shall be assigned unto her the third part of all the lands of her husband, which were his during coverture, except she were endowed of less at the church door. So what I find interesting about this fifth subclause is that the widow receives 1/3 of the property. Now, from what I understand, that the reason that it's 1/3 is that the widow would be given a significant portion, although a minority portion, so that she would be secure in her inheritance. But the remainder would often go to the heir or heirs, that of the male members of the household. Usually the eldest son, the law of primogeniture. He, or the primary heirs, would inherit the bulk of the estate. Now this coverture, literally, it refers to a covering. And I think this refers to the covering in a symbolic sense of the husband over the wife after they've gotten married. That it's his responsibility to her to provide for her in the case of his absence and during the duration of their marriage. And the exception in this clause is if she were endowed with less at the church door, which would probably be a declaration made by the husband right when they got married, the church door being that symbolic place for which these sorts of things are determined. And the last subclause of clause 7, no widow shall be distrained to marry herself, nevertheless she shall find surety, and that she shall not marry without our license and assent, if she hold of us, nor without the assent of the Lord, if she hold of another. Now, given that a widow is quite a vulnerable person, and this person can be taken advantage of, 1/3 of an estate, depending on the size of the estate, can be quite a substantial sum. And surely, on the part of the barons, they would see themselves as somewhat of an independent identity that would wish to keep control of that resource under their banner or will. The language here is rather confusing to me, but understandable nonetheless. No widow shall be distrained to marry herself. So distrained in this context means to be coerced or forced into marriage. that in the broader context, this is an identification that the widow has the right to choose whom she may marry. Nevertheless, she shall find surety, or some guarantor for her security, for her safety, and the people that are the surety are the barons, in this case. Nevertheless, she shall find surety that she shall not marry without our license and assent, or approval, if she hold of us. And in this sense, if she hold of us, I believe is referring to the idea that she is appealing to them, that she is holding on to them for that security. And in that case, they take the responsibility. Nor without the assent of the Lord. And in this way, it would probably go through the church. But the approval of God. So there has to be a way, there has to be a sort of a spiritual court in which what she is participating in is good for her as a human being, good for her soul. An interesting thing to write into law. And however practical this was, it's difficult to say. I can imagine that this was fraught with all sorts of difficulties, and the unfortunate aspect of our nature probably crept in many times, in the sense that the assent of the Lord was put by the wayside for more political, practical purposes, again, of ensuring where the inheritance actually went, to which person, rather than, as I said, the health of the soul. But of course, practical matters are not to be thought of as completely negative. That to marry somebody of good standing, I think, is to secure inheritance down the line, and that is a prudent decision. It is something of a religious decision, that one looks towards the future for their offspring. Nonetheless, it is a dynamic issue that would require honest deliberation. Quite discerning spiritual judges would have to be present in those types of situations. Nor without assent of the Lord if she hold of another, or wishes to remarry. So that finishes Clause 7. I'd like to continue now with Clause 8, titled, How Sureties Shall be Charged to the King. I'm debating whether or not I should say a thing or two before getting into this. I just read it over. I'll have to read it over a few times. But before I started this recording, I had a strange series of thoughts. And being that life is such a roller coaster of emotion, and sometimes that roller coaster of emotion tempts us into focusing on things that are other than something productive, something that is worthwhile in life, they can serve as roadblocks, disruptions, a break in the chain, if you will. I imagine a train that is running on a track, and that track just is split, separated, whatever, and the train runs off it, no longer able to go to some destination for some purpose and transmit that purpose through time. It dies there on the side of the road. A bit of a personal matter, I suppose. But all the same, this explosion of being, this experience that we all share, how fraught it is with these types of feelings that get in the way, but also the very feelings that facilitate our highest purposes, that drive us without question, that make us love so deeply. All of this finds itself within the mind of man and his relationships, his personal relationships, the network that's built upon the collective experience of different minds, that of institutions, that of any number of numerous principalities. And then back down again to the individual and the constitution therein. How this can take different forms, rather. How it can develop. How it can be degraded. But in a fundamental observational standpoint, how it can relate itself and how it can orient itself. And I find that this agentic quality that is occupied by these various levels, both of the communal and of the individual, what exactly it means for one class of person to be superior than another, in what ways, what types of qualities supports that idea that one is superior to another. Superiority aside, we could pick any number of dimensions. We could think of just that financial relationship. And I think I went to that superiority relationship first because the financial relationship in this situation, I think, is bound up within it. If we're talking about sureties, especially if we're talking about sureties among the nobility and those who are underneath them, there is this image in that feudal structure of the superiority versus inferiority. And not to say that this sort of thing doesn't exist today, or that because it existed then that it ought not to exist today. It is a part of our experience. There are ways in which I think we can relate to our fellow person that does not assume too much in terms of differences and abilities, whatever. But there are plenty of ways in which our differences matter and actually truly mean something. And the place or the station that a certain type of person finds or achieves is quite important. So again, Clause 8, how sureties shall be charged to the king. We or our bailiffs shall not seize any land or rent for any debt, as long as the present goods and chattels of the debtor do suffice to pay the debt, and the debtor himself be ready to satisfy therefor. 2. Neither shall the pledges of the debtor be distrained, as long as the principal debtor is sufficient for the payment of the debt. 3. And if the principal debtor fail in the payment of the debt, have nothing wherewith to pay, or will not pay where he is able, the pledges shall answer for the debt. 4. And if they will, they shall have the lands and rents of the debtor, until they be satisfied of that which they before paid for him, except that the debtor can show himself to be acquitted against the said sureties. So I want to spend some time on this one. Any time the word surety is mentioned, I think it invokes an important relationship. So before we get into each one of these subclauses, I want to talk about this title, because the title in and of itself is indicative of something. And also I want to call to attention the broad approaches that we can take. What I mean by that is we can examine this contextually for the period that it exists in, but also the spiritual element, which I find the most fascinating. And the reason that I find this the most fascinating, and also speaking on why I think the spiritual matter is of importance, why it is significant, and what exactly it is, I think it is the very thread that runs through this whole thing that causes the Magna Carta to be a document that will persist throughout time. While each individual clause may lose its contemporary or contextual relevance, the spirit and the thread of this document, I think, is the thing that outlives the individual clauses. The other thing that I'll mention is that in the first episode, when I gave an introduction, it came as in part a reflection on the broader book that this Magna Carta was discussing. And it was primarily focused on the 17th century leading up to the Glorious Revolution in 1688 in England. And the discussion at the time invoked many different sides, as most discussions do, as most dialogues or arguments do. There was one that I found to be accurate to a degree, but also only accurate to a point, and that was the one in which the Magna Carta was only relevant as a historical document, that it set no precedent that would be relevant in the age, in that time, the contemporary age. But even now, I think we can make the same type of argument. And I want to, although there is understanding on my part that this argument applies to maybe specific statutes, in which if we take one of these clauses, enact it into law, there may be some gross malalignment in terms of its application. But by the same token, just because we do not necessarily approach this document in that way doesn't mean that when we say it's a historical document that it somehow reduces it only to the study of a historian and not to be on the minds of a free citizen or of any number of government officials. In the way in which it's on the mind of the citizen or on the mind of the government individual is, I think, in the spiritual domain, in the spiritual sense. So beginning with this title, and I'm using some assistance from the internet to help me with the etymology of words. If one is unfamiliar with my series on the Proverbs, often, always, essentially, I will be looking at the etymology of words, trying to build a broader image of what the word means, try to understand the various relationships within that word and contextually within the sentence to make sense of it. Sometimes that can be quite tedious, but ultimately, usually, I should say, it comes to some productive end, but sometimes it takes a little while to get there. So this is my interpretation. If it's not realized already, it's a bit of a marathon more than it is a brief reading or summary. So how sureties shall be charged to the king? This is the title. The key word here is surety. Now what can we say of this word? From my perspective, the word surety often becomes muddled and confused, especially the way in which it's used grammatically. Whenever I encounter this term in the Proverbs, and there are a few different areas where it comes up, I always have to go through the exercise again of understanding exactly what it means and what that relationship is. Because in some sense, it's a profound one. It's a highly relational one. So if we go back to the Latin, we have the word securitas, which meant freedom from care or danger. The prefix meaning without, cura meaning care or concern. And so we have this liberatory element which touches on the spirit of this document, because there is a overarching sense of a liberatory undercurrent that the baronial class wishes to be more independent in their operation from the institution of the monarch than prior. They wish to reestablish, from their view, ancient liberties and to codify those liberties into law. Now, in the spiritual sense, or the proverbial sense, when we say freedom from, or without care or concern from something, we have to imagine that there is layers, there are levels to this sort of thing. The surety and the relationship that invokes is but a small aspect of the broader way in which man is oriented to God, or that transcendence. Or we could just say to concepts of ideals or forms in the Platonic sense. And we could say that in terms of the various virtues and how these are expressed through our institutions, and even right down to our own individual behavior and thoughts. But with regard to the surety, when we say freedom or concern from something, usually we have more of a monetary context, an economic context. That a surety, this is the first point that's important to understand, refers to a person. So whenever we see the word surety, we must think of some person. Now this person has a particular responsibility. This responsibility is for another's debts, or an obligation. This could involve legally guaranteeing the performance of a duty or the repayment of a loan. We could also think of the term security or assurance that something will be fulfilled. And so we have to imagine, well, in what places would we find these people that take on this type of responsibility? Now, in the proverbial sense, what we are warned against is the person becoming a surety for a neighbor. That if we don't exercise proper judgment in our business affairs, then by the imprudence of others, we may be drawn into that unfortunate behavior. But there's a broader context, there's a broader position here that I think is important. Because the surety, in this way, just thinking about it simplistically from one person to somebody living next door, that if I have a good relationship, or maybe I don't have a good relationship, but just because I feel that somebody close to me, even if it be a neighbor, ought to be free from some pernicious debt or some pernicious obligation, I may undertake that. But also we can think about it in terms of a family member to family member. We could think about it in terms of a police officer and maybe a juvenile who continually gets in trouble. We can think about it from a teacher, standpoint of a teacher, to that of a student. And so there are all different types of obligations and relationships that one person can provide security or assurance for something. Also, I think what is important to keep in mind is the necessary condition under which a person can become a surety. The person that becomes a surety must be, though it is not necessarily so, and I'll explain that in a moment, but they must be in a position where they can actually offer that thing. They must be able to offer the security or the assurance, or the penalty that would otherwise come down on the debtor, or the person responsible for the initial obligation, comes now to the surety. Because from a legal standpoint, or from a standpoint that matters, if it's not legal, maybe it's just a relationship, and let's say the student and the teacher situation. The teacher is responsible for the failure of the student if the student had promised the teacher something. Now, the teacher must, this is kind of a strange example, so maybe like the father and the son is a better example, in which the father provides the son with security or assurance for their educational expenses. This obligation is passed then on to the parent. The parent must hold that burden, that debt, and while the son is free then to be productive in life. The one thing I want to mention here before I get too far into the weeds, there may be some strange sound in the background, and I'll say that is my cat. She is a bit overweight, and I think she has some sleep apnea. But I've just shaken her a little bit, so now she is awake, but she may fall asleep again and resume her strange sleeping noises. But in any case, I suppose it adds some character to this episode. How sureties shall be charged to the king. So now that we have this understanding of the surety, well, let me move back one more time, because there's another thing that I mentioned that I wanted to get into. And this was the statement that I made, that the surety must always be in a position to be able to provide that assurance. And it's a strange thing, because anybody can be in that position. Anybody can take responsibility for somebody else's behavior and suffer the consequences or the burdens that are as a consequence of that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the person who is the surety has the necessary monies or has the necessary authority to actually relieve the burden. Full stop. Which is why I think, at least in part, in the proverbial sense, we are warned against taking on the obligations of another, especially if it's beyond our means. But from this, I think the relationship that begins to form, or the broad image that begins to form, is how much of a difficult situation this can be, and how quickly it can spiral or be taken advantage of. That if a person holds the obligation, there's this sort of extended line of indebtedness. That now the surety, especially if the surety, for whatever reason, this is a convoluted relationship, but let's say the surety is the king, and the king serves both this role of the creditor, but also the person that is taking on the responsibility. And given that the king is head of state, in a sense, there is this, I think, profound possibility that the king can take advantage of that relationship. Or if that doesn't quite get to the heart of it, then maybe there is some falsities in what I said there. At the very least, the king has a relationship to the sureties. And that if those relationships between the surety and the debtor, but also the surety and law, if these were not regulated, then surely it would be possible for the king's officers to exploit the sureties, the people that are responsible for the obligation, just as much as a debtor can be exploited by a creditor. And so we have this sort of explicit, again, codified experience in which we are establishing a relationship that is upheld by some authority. How surety shall be charged to the king. Now, charged to the king, meaning that the king is now responsible for ensuring that the sureties will actually uphold their obligations, their responsibilities. That the surety just does not abandon their relationship to the debtor, let's say. But if they indeed underwent that relationship, then they will be held accountable. And that will be enforced by the king's court. Another interesting thing here, I think, is the way in which this is beholden to the king. It's not necessarily a liberatory clause. It's more of a clause that wishes law to be a particular way, but specifically law of the king's court to be a particular way. In this way, they are saying that the king has an important responsibility, and this is one of them. So moving into the first subclause, we are bailiffs, shall not seize any land or rent for any debt, as long as the present goods and chattels of the debtor do suffice to pay the debt, and the debtor himself be ready to satisfy therefor. So there are two words that I want to begin by defining and talking about a little bit. The first word is bailiffs, a word that we still use today, a word that generally refers to the courtroom officer that upholds order in that room and executes the judge's orders. So a bailiff in this context refers to an official of the baronial class, most likely. The enforcer, the manager, the rent collector, the debt collector, the insurer of justice in a particular area. So just like the bailiff in a courtroom, this person carries out orders, maintaining legal obligations. So from the French bailiff, from the Old French, the word bailiff had the meaning of administrative official or overseer, derived from the Latin bajulis, meaning carrier or bearer of responsibility. So the arm of any established institution, we can say, whether it be the king's court or the parliamentarian court, or this sort of pre-parliamentarian court, the baronial court. Now the other word I want to describe is chattel. Now the word chattel refers to personal movable property, such as livestock, household items, or other belongings owned by the debtor. Now this is in opposition to immovable property or fixed assets, like land or buildings. So in medieval law, chattels were distinct from real property, as I've mentioned, the fixed assets, and were the first items to be taken to satisfy debts. So again, thinking about the etymology, from Old French we have chattel, meaning property or goods, coming from ultimately that Latin word capital, meaning wealth, property, or capital, closely related to the modern word cattle, and that's a reflection on the historical importance of livestock as a form of wealth. So again, when we think about chattel, we're thinking about movable goods. Now, why is there a distinction between goods and chattels? And I could just imagine that goods would refer to the whole class of things that can be used to satisfy debts, both movable and immovable goods, and then chattels would be just that movable portion of goods. So again, we or our bailiffs shall not seize any land or rent for any debt. So we, in this context, I think, can refer to the king's court, or again the baronial class, the people that are in that position to be writing such a declaration. We or our bailiffs shall not seize any land or rent for any debt, as long as the present goods and chattels of the debtor do suffice to pay the debt. Okay, this is fairly reasonable. They're saying that given their, let's see, it's easy, I think, to fall into a simple interpretation here. But again, I have this desire to understand our experience. And as I go throughout my days, as the weeks go by, as the early mornings come, and the late nights fade into fatigue and exhaustion following my working life, in my heart I have this desire to figure it out. Not necessarily because I believe that I will come to a conclusion, that I'll know everything, which of course I will not, but as a means to understand how I ought to be oriented to things, how to be a good person, how to make wise decisions. The examination of things at a particular level, in a particular state of heart, or in the proverbial sense, walking in one's uprightness, requires a type of openness and honesty and vulnerability that a simplistic definition, although true, may not satisfy. And so when I see this description of thinking about, the way in which this society was organized, about the king having that ultimate authority, under him that nobility class, and under them the various subclasses, all the way down to the peasants, the serfs. I think about what this means. I think about if we are securing a sense that if a person has material sufficient enough to pay something, that for whatever the cause, their materials should not be taken from them, and that perhaps they should be given that credit status. And it makes me think about the situation before this was codified into law, how arbitrary that situation must have been. If a person is in debt for X amount. Who's to say what that amount is before the bailiff starts taking their possessions? Some arbitrary value that is placed on their possession to satisfy some debt that they have. And I think this threshold, as strange and maybe even arbitrary as it may seem in and of itself, at the very least, it gives the idea a security that as long as the person maintains themselves within certain bounds, they will not be maybe taken advantage of, they will not be severely tyrannized of their material possessions or of their person. And the debtor himself be ready to satisfy therefore. Now, subclause 2, neither shall the pledge of the debtor be distrained, as long as the principal debtor is sufficient for the payment of the debt. Now I want to talk about this word distrained. We've seen this word before, but I want to go through the exercise of defining it once more. So from Middle English, the term distrainen was used to mean to seize property, to compel payment or compliance. Now this word was borrowed from the Old French, meaning to constrain, to force, or to compel. Now from Latin roots, we have the word distingere, meaning to stretch apart, pull in different directions, or to constrain. Dis, the prefix meaning apart or in different directions, is stringere, meaning to bind tightly or to draw tight, which gives us words like stringent and strain. But specifically, by the Middle Ages, this word distrain came to refer to the legal act of seizing someone's goods or property to enforce payment of a debt or to fulfill an obligation. Now, this pledge effectively makes this debtor a type of surety. That they, within their pledge, are saying that there's a way in which this obligation will be fulfilled. That there is some assurance given. Neither shall the pledges of the debtor be distrained. Again, distrained meaning, in the context of this pledge, that it shall not be abolished, given certain requirements, that the principal debtor is sufficient for the payment of the debt. And if the principal debtor fail in the payment of the debt, having nothing wherewith to pay, or will not pay where he is able, the pledges shall answer for the debt. This is the third subclause. So what does it mean? That last part of that subclause is quite important. The pledges shall answer for the debt. Well, there are many ways, I think, that we can interpret this. There are many ways in which a debtor may fail to meet an obligation. But regardless of his reason, after the fact, the pledge that the debtor made at the signing of that agreement is the thing that holds him to his obligation, that it cannot sort of be arbitrarily modified. And again, this is the thing that the barons are wishing that the king is responsible for upholding under law. So both we have a sense of protection for the debtor, but also a certain type of protection for the creditor, in the sense that the obligations that the debtor undertook are adhered to by the initial pledge on the part of the debtor. Subclause 4, and if they will, they shall have the lands and rents of the debtor, until they be satisfied of that which they before paid for him, except that the debtor can show himself to be acquitted against the said sureties. Now this last clause, subclause, is the relationship between the surety and the debtor, not necessarily the debtor and the creditor. And if they will, they shall have the lands and rents of the debtor, until they be satisfied of that which they before paid for him. So again, this is the indication that they are the surety, because they are paying for his, they are undertaking his responsibility or his obligation. So they're transferring that credit to a different place. Kind of a strange thing. Except that the debtor can show himself to be acquitted against the said sureties. So in the case of a bankruptcy type situation, if it is the case, for whatever reason, that the debtor is unable to fulfill his obligation for purposes unforeseen to the pledges that were originally given, maybe, or just unforeseen in general, then he has the right to have his day in court, to have his perspective heard and seen. And I think that this sense of openness at the end here is a beautiful thing, because it recognizes the importance of deliberation and of the potential of that which is unseen to be actually true and just. So moving on to Clause 9, the liberties of London and other cities and towns confirmed. That's the title. The city of London shall have the old liberties and customs which it has been used to have. Moreover, we will and grant that all other cities, boroughs, towns, and the barons of the 5 ports, and all other ports, shall have all their liberties and free customs. So today is a new day. It's a perfect time to get into a new clause. As I've said, this is Clause 9. The liberties of London and other cities and towns confirmed. So I would just like to reiterate that we are taking the proverbial approach here, and what that means is a couple of different things. Part of it is my own description of a proverbial approach to a text. When I say proverbial, I mean the book of Proverbs, the approach that I have developed by going over the book of Proverbs more specifically. It has meant a couple of different things. One, that we are concerned with etymology of words when they come up, but also of the broader significance that the particular pattern of wording brings up. And that's sort of a broad statement, but more specifically, I suppose what I mean by that is many times language, and even the most simplistic of sentences, can provide us with an insight into something that is a bit broader, a bit more detailed about the substructure of the reality that we participate in that we may have not otherwise considered. And while at times it may seem a bit tedious, I think it is, in the end, a productive pursuit, which is why I wish to do it. So the first thing that comes to mind here, considering Clause 9, is the reference to the old liberties. Now, there's a bit of difficulty here because I'm not a historian. I'm not particularly well read on the primary sources of the era. And of the era, of an era that predates the 13th century when this was written. And also, or maybe more specifically, I should say that what's likely being referred to here is prior to the Norman conquest in the 10th century. But doing some additional research here, I believe that it refers both to, I think primarily to the Anglo-Saxon period, but also to the liberties that were guaranteed under William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror issued a charter to London shortly after the conquest, confirming its liberties and customs as they existed before his rule. So the question becomes, what exactly were those specific liberties? I have a few examples here, which I will read. Election of officials. London had the right to elect its own mayor and sheriffs, reflecting ancient self-governance practices. Exemptions from toll taxes. Merchants in London and other towns enjoyed freedom from certain tolls when trading across England, protecting their economic interests. Fair legal treatment. Citizens of London were entitled to trial within their own courts, rather than being subjected to royal or foreign jurisdictions. Protection of markets. Cities controlled their own markets and fairs, preserving their customs for trade regulation. So there's a couple things to be said here. The first is the recognition of the position of the City of London, but also, as the title suggests, and other cities and towns confirmed, there's an interesting reflection about the way that things used to be, the way that they used to be. The baronial class seemed to believe that this organization of society was more productive. It was less restrictive in the negative sense. But I think there's a much broader conversation, again, as sticking with what we have, the general theme of the Magna Carta, is exactly what this liberty is. What it means for the individual principalities in question, London being the principal one. So let's undergo the exercise again about the word liberty, exploring its etymological roots. The word comes from the Latin noun libertas, which means freedom or the state of being free. Libertas is derived from the adjective liber, meaning free. In Latin, liber originally referred to someone who is not enslaved, signifying personal freedom and autonomy. The word liber also connects to ideas of generosity and independence. The Proto-Indo-European root, the Latin liber, traces back to the root leud, L-E-U-D-H, meaning to grow or to belong to the people. The same root gives rise to related terms in other languages, such as the Old English leod, meaning people or nation, and German leut, L-E-U-T-E, meaning people. So from these roots, what is this broader idea? And how does it relate to the concepts of individualization of principality? How does this relate to tyranny, or the idea of tyranny? How is this related to a hierarchical structure for which the monarch is at the head of that structure. What more can be said about the ancient liberties? So just considering our root here, thinking about terms of being free and of enslavement, this is where I want to begin. So what does it mean to be a slave? In my mind, I struggle sometimes because there are plenty of things that can restrict our movement, our mental movement. There are plenty of things that can disrupt our attention. But among these many things, we wouldn't necessarily say that we are enslaved to them. But also among many of them, and certain configurations of them, we would say that we can be considered to be enslaved by them. I think part of this is culturally formed and shaped. When I think of a slave, I think of more of an absolute definition or an absolute condition under which a person, their individual autonomy is severely restricted. They are owned in a way. Their being is considered to be a possession of another being. That their will, although in some sense, in a strict sense, outside of that arbitrary relationship, their will still exists, but it is much curtailed by the institution, let's say, of slavery. Now, the etymology of the word slave itself, I think, is interesting. The existence of the value that is held within the word slave, or what we consider to be the definition of the word slave in the contemporary context, has broad implications. Slavery predated, in other words, the events that led to the creation of the word, let's say, which I find to be interesting. So in other languages, of course, there would be other terms for the word slave that essentially meant the same thing. But for our purposes, the word slave comes from the Latin word sclavis, which is derived from the Byzantine Greek word sklavos, which referred to a Slav, a member of the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe. And in that context, during the early Middle Ages, large numbers of Slavic people were captured and enslaved by invading forces, particularly by Germanic tribes, Vikings, and Muslims in the Mediterranean region. These Slavic captives were so frequently enslaved that their ethnic name, Slav, became synonymous with the condition of servitude. Now, the word Slav and the Latin sklavos originates from the Proto-Slavic word, something that I cannot pronounce, meaning a Slavic person. This in turn derives from Proto-Indo-European root klu, meaning to hear or fame, as the Slavs refer to themselves as the people who speak a common language, or the renowned ones. So I find this interesting. Of course, the word Slav does not necessarily come from the idea of slavery, but because of this historical event that the Slavs were enslaved so frequently, that the word slave and its relatedness to the word Slav came about. And so it doesn't really tell us much about the condition of slavery, of course. I think the condition is something that we can explore, something that we just have explored. But the reason that I bring this up is because there is a strong relationship here. When we're speaking about liberation, freedom from, there's some restriction that one party feels to be in such an orientation that could be considered almost like a slave-master relationship. That there's some fundamental limitation on the agency of the agent in question, whether that be a single individual, whether that be a collection of individuals, like what we are talking about here, a city or a town, or something larger. When we think about the Norman conquest, we think about one large principality invading another relatively large principality that includes many towns and cities. And in the context of the Magna Carta, at that level, the first clause speaks about the liberation of the English Church, both from probably the king's civil institution, but also in terms of the papal authority. Here we have many different churches that comprise the English Church, and there are many churches in general that are under the banner of the papal see of the Catholic Church. So let's try to open this up a little bit. So I understand that there is this desire to be free from the tyranny of the king, let's say. The current relationship is proving to be difficult for certain things, for certain situations. I think that there's a lot that goes into this, from the individual level to more of that collective cultural level. But despite this sort of thing happening then or happening now, I think the spirit is the same. There's something much deeper going on here. So if we consider this to be a matter of organization, I think the question can be had, well, what is the function of organization? Why do we have this desire to be independent? As we discussed before, true independence is not really something that exists. It's not a concept of infinity. It is not something that can be. True liberation is contextual, that we can identify it given certain relationships and certain constraints. And the reason that I think we can identify liberty in the context of the American Revolution, but fail to see it in the contemporary American experience, is because of these contextual factors. And once the contextual factors are made known, then American liberty will again sprout its head. It'll be known among the collective. Now there's a point of clarification that I'd like to make. I think I may have confused a few terms in there when I said infinity, and I made this comparison between that term and the word liberty. We can think about liberty in an infinity sense, in which it's this principle for which we are constantly moving away from something, liberating ourselves such that we are free from something, we are giving ourselves something, taking away from another relationship. We can think about relationality in general. We can think about material objects or more conscious experiences. It doesn't really matter. But we can boil this down to quite fundamental parts, in the sense that if we wish all things to be free from other things, in the sense that there are no relationships anymore, then this is a state of maximal entropy and disorder. This is not something that tends towards what in our purposes would be productive, meaningful, useful. In fact, it would lead to death. You think about this sort of thing happening to mind, it would be the destruction of identity. It would be the destruction of the self. When you think about this sort of thing in terms of the body, it would be the death of the body, of course the death of the mind in the material sense, the So the conscious experience would have no vehicle to exist in this plane. But again, if we think about liberty in the sense that there are finite ways to free ourselves from relationships that are unproductive, which is possible. Relationships are important for good ends, but unproductive relationships can actually serve almost like the infinity sense, be so restrictive and so restrictive such that the relationships themselves do not afford themselves or give themselves enough space for productive ends. And I suppose that we can say in a number of ways that this can be good and this can be bad. If we have a bunch of individual agents, all of them are liberated in the sense that, of course, sense, context, in the sense that they are not slaves, their minds are not subject, they're not the very that software or the operating system that is experiencing consciousness is not somehow arbitrarily limited or coerced or dampened by the will of another, such that their will becomes an extension of theirs. If we have all of these individual agents now that in their day have this sense of autonomy, liberation from something, they are open now to a broader experience. That in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean that the broader experience will afford them with a better way of life. It'll just give them the opportunity to do so. So the underlying apparatus, the cultural substructure that they operate on, is extremely important because it's the thing that will unite all of them in ways that make them relate to one another in ways that are what we might say is in accordance with the spirit of liberty, with the contextual liberty. The spirit of liberty in the sense that this spirit is something that's valuable to us, but it is not the absolute and arbitrary destruction of order. So to round out this clause and to bring it to some conclusion, I want to read it one more time. The City of London shall have all the old liberties and customs which it has been used to have. Moreover, we will and grant that all other cities, boroughs, towns, and barons of the 5 ports, and all other ports shall have their liberties and free customs. So again, thinking about this liberty in the contextual sense, we are thinking about this organizational structure. As mentioned, cities, boroughs, towns, barons of the 5 ports, etc., to the principal authority of the monarch. That because of the perceived overreach of the monarch's authority, the relationships of the towns, of the people within the towns, everything is getting clogged up. Now it's possible that we can say, and the argument has been made, that this is only, the ideas here are only put forth for the self-preservation, self-advancement of the barons of the time. And this is possible, but I think also there can be elements of other productive relations that are brought forth by this type of desire to liberate, to separate from the king, to a degree, not completely, of course. Now I think this will come back around to our formulation of exactly what the relationships were at the time. This is something that's, I think, slowly going to unfold for us. And as that happens, those relationships are going to afford us a view of the Spirit. And the view of the Spirit is the thing that I think makes this a foundational document. It's not one specific clause that does it. So with this in mind, we'll move on to Clause 10. None shall distrain for more service than is due. No man shall be distrained to do more service for a knight's fee, nor any freehold, than therefore is due. So the first thing that I'm anxious to describe is something that might seem kind of foreign to us, but I think it's important to understand the position of this person and their relative place in society. In the context of the 13th century in England, a freehold referred to land or property held for life or with hereditary rights without the obligation of performing servile duties. It granted the freeholder the right to occupy and use the land indefinitely, as long as they fulfilled certain obligations such as military service or rent, depending on the type of tenure. Now, in the reflection of this hierarchy, the freeholders were distinguished from leasehold, villein tenure, where the tenant's rights were more limited and often subject to the will of a lord. A freehold estate provided greater security and autonomy to the holder, as they could pass the land to their heirs and were protected under the law from arbitrary dispossession. So that is from my quick search of the freehold. There's one more thing to add here, just to give this some context. There were different types of freehold tenures, including knight's service, holding land in return for military service, socage, paying rent or providing non-military service to the lord, and frankelmoin, holding land granted to the church or clergy in return for religious service or prayers. So this is quite a foundational clause. It is saying no man shall be distrained to do more service for a knight's fee, nor any freehold, than therefore is due. So what are the implications of this? I think it's easy, given a certain state of mind, to think well shy of the true implications. That we don't live under a feudal hierarchy, that the concerns of the past do not necessarily reflect our current state or ambitions or relations, but I think it's quite the contrary. This idea of providing against arbitrary authority, the assumption that there is intrinsic worth to having some right. Now my mind here wishes to pause because throughout all of human history, certainly in the context of what we see here, the knowledge of the ancient world was permeated through this society. Granted, many people were illiterate, most people were illiterate. So the type of transformation perhaps that can occur in an individual may have been limited. When we think about biblical transformation, we think about the software that is installed by large religious customs and traditions. On one hand, there's always that risk for institutional control and the collapse of the system to effectively facilitate a richer experience of life. But there's also, and always perhaps, that possibility for which the mind can find itself understanding, oriented, ontologically aware of their own self-worth. And throughout history, I think that we see various forms of societal organization, various forms of tyranny, various ideas of the individual and of the self. And I think here, what I wish to reflect on is the nature of the relationship at this time. That there was a culture of individuals that wished to provide against this arbitrary authority, to assume that the individual has certain rights, that the individual has a certain worth that is beyond what the king can control, beyond the king's authority. And the restriction, the coercion that is necessarily practiced under a condition in which the king may require more than what is due. I think that expression in and of itself is interesting, because what do we say is due? A fundamental question of every subject, even today, as citizens, what is due of us? Where does the line limit? Where does the line ask? Where do our liberties end? Where do our obligations begin? When I think about the orientation of the medieval person to the king, to the sovereign, we're speaking of a particular relationship, of course. We're thinking about a participation in that society, born of an older warrior-like society, in which principal chieftains ruled and provided protection to the people that were within their dominion. The king was the sole landowner, we could say, in the strict sense of the words, in the terms of an absolute monarch, that everything in the kingdom was under his authority. The people that lived on the land participated in the society, in the culture, by certain sacrifices. For them to be a part of that experience, they must be subject to the king. They must offer military service. They must offer labor on land. And of course, within this feudal hierarchy, we have this structured or tiered authority apparatus for which the king is at the top. The way in which we would analyze this now is no different. The only thing that is different is the structure of the society. But the analysis and asking the question, what is due of me? What is my relationship to the state? What is my relationship to this thing that I call the culture that I am a part of? These questions don't change. No man shall be distrained to do more service for a knight's fee, nor any freehold than therefore is due. So I'll speak a little bit more on this and then move on to the next clause. The other thing that's interesting about this is the declaration, the limit that is placed on service. And here I think we see a departure, an awakening perhaps, on the part of some. But as I've mentioned, I question this idea of an awakening, because all of the substructure, certainly the structure of mind was no different then than it is now. A person can find themselves in that particular orientation or disposition against a tyrant or against some authority. They can claim their rights. And there are many ways of organizing the mind that are quite institutional. We think about the Bible and think about all of the wisdom contained in there. It is impossible to come away from that experience being individually exposed to the verses and to the experience of reflecting and praying, that the individual would not grow and not change. It is, I think, almost impossible for it not to happen. And all of this material, all of the material substructure, again, that is necessary for the mind to transform and to change, is readily available to the people of this age. And given multiple factors, illiteracy, as I've mentioned, being one, but certainly other things, the powers among the various principalities are always, and probably forever will be, at least in the human experience, a tricky force to maneuver. They find themselves in, the spirits find themselves in positions of authority, positions of mind, positions of collective mind that have influence. They have agency. They can form a sort of collective pathology at times. We see that quite readily and obviously in the modern day. They can be beautiful, wondrous, stable. There is everything under the sun when it comes to these large collective phenomena. And it seems quite clear, at least in this instance, that the mind has found itself in some constitutional disposition, that there is some precedent that was set at some age prior that is referred to, that at some point a knight's fee, or the obligations of a freehold, were established, and at some point, perhaps, the prerogative of the monarch overshadowed those ancient privileges. Even if this was a novel situation, and even if this language that is used is wishing to refer to something that happened in the past that had no basis, but now is this new emerging thing, regardless of the situation, we have the idea of this established relationship. What necessarily, I think, must follow from this is farther questioning about, okay, we have a declaration about my disposition, my orientation to the monarch. What else is there for the individual? What type of burdens, what kind of authority can the individual possess? What is the role of leadership in man's experience? Ought it be this highly centralized, highly restrictive in some cases, organizational structure for which the primary productive cultural movement is controlled by very few? Clause 11, common pleas shall not follow the king's court. That is the title. The body being, common pleas shall not follow our court, but shall be holden in some place certain. Now, the thing to begin with here, I think, is a common plea. A common plea, I think, can come from an individual. It can come from many people. I think it could be said that it may be a complaint, it may be a statement, it may be a statement made before some judicial body about the guilt or innocence of a person or persons. Maybe a supplication, a petition, a request. Whatever it might be. Whatever the situation that would prompt a subject to go to the civil authority or to go to some organization of men to arbitrate difference or concern. What is being said here is that the pleas shall not follow the king's court. Now, what exactly does that mean? If I were to follow somebody, whether it be walking or in my car, I would follow them closely behind. Of course, this applies to motion. But if we apply it to something like the king's court, we know that the king's court is not in motion. And yet, nonetheless, we are saying that the pleas ought not to follow them, indicating that before this point, the pleas were following the king's court, or at least some portion of them were. So the movement of the king's court must appear differently in definition, in mind. So the question is obvious. Well, in what way is it different? Well, there must be a symbolic difference. That the king's court has motion in the sense that it has authority, and also in the sense that it has novel thought, a novel structure, architecture, infrastructure, legal infrastructure. And my apologies for the barrage of words here, but there is an idea that I have in mind that as we consider the symbolism as it relates to the king's court, we must know and we must understand that every institution has its purpose, and by its purpose, the function that it possesses will have a conception, an idea of movement. And here, the movement is a bit broad. It can, I think, include discipline, the keeping of law, the keeping of certain boundaries, such that people don't transgress them. If they did, it would provide for instability of the culture of that society, and so the laws need to be in place. Laws may be in place to benefit a particular class, a particular group of people. The execution of that may find itself in all sorts of unfortunate and maybe bizarre cases. The point being that the movement of the king's court is occupied among all of the various duties that one can imagine a civil institution would find itself responsible for. And so if we say that a common plea shall not follow the king's court, what are we to say? Are we to say that the plea ought not to adhere to the law established by the king's court? That's one possible interpretation. But certainly, thus far, the spirit of the Magna Carta is not one to break from the authority of the king, but rather to alter the relationship to it. So it's likely not indicating that pleas ought not to, or that pleas, common pleas, ought to be separate from the jurisdiction of the king's authority, but rather that there is something about the plea and the arbitration and the place of the king's court that may not be appropriate to the solving of these types of issues. Not that they don't have authority here. Common pleas shall not follow our court. And what I think is also interesting here is that in the first instance they mention the king's court, but assuming that this is the Magna Carta, is something that is produced, written by the nobility, and in the terminology, the grammar that is used here, our court, would imply a parliamentary or some precursor to the parliament, parliamentary body on behalf of the nobility of this society. But shall be holden in some place certain. Now, some certain place would be a place for the commons. Perhaps this is the case because the king's court, or the parliamentary court, is specific to the body of the parliament, the nobility, or of the sovereign class, and the problems that are brought up there. So effectively, what is created is a new aspect of civil jurisdiction, some regular civil jurisdiction specifically to hear the pleas of the commons. Now, I wanted my best to give an interpretation of what I knew before doing any background research. Perhaps that's not the best way to go about it, but I think it's often good to exercise the mind in that way before really going to the background if it's unknown. So there is something here that I failed to know. I mentioned that the interpretation of this is more symbolic than it is literal, of following, literally, physically following the king's court. But this turns out actually not to be entirely true, although the symbolic interpretation I think still holds. Before the Magna Carta, cases or common pleas were often heard by the king's court, but they followed the king's court as it moved around the country. And it created difficulties for the litigants, since they had to travel wherever the king's court was located, which was expensive and time-consuming. There was no fixed location for resolving common legal disputes, making these proceedings inconsistent and inconvenient to them, to the people. So effectively what we are seeing here is that the separation from the common pleas from the king's court contributed to a development of a stable and independent judiciary. So that is from ChatGPT. Very useful information. But regardless of the itinerant nature of the king's court at that time, and that the people actually literally had to follow the king, wherever the court was, in order to have their disputes heard, I do think that the symbolic approach, that understanding the purpose of this, continues to hold water, to have weight to it. And I say that because regardless of that traveling court, the stable and independent judiciary that was formed was meant to address common grievances. And I think that what's more than just the itinerant nature of the king's court is the nature of the king's court itself, that it was insufficient to arbitrate disputes. More, again, than just time, expense, and location. Clause 11, the title reads, Where and before whom assizes shall be taken. Adjournment for difficulty. So now the body reads, Assizes of novel disseisin and of mortan sester shall not be taken but in the shires, and after this manner. If we be out of this realm, our Chief Justice shall send our justicers through every county once in the year, which with the knights of the shires shall take the said assizes in those counties. 2. And those things that at the coming of our aforesaid justicers, being sent to take those assizes in the counties, cannot be determined, shall be ended by them in some other place in their circuit. 3. And those things which for difficulty of some articles cannot be determined by them shall be referred to our justicers of the bench, and there shall be ended. So this one was a bit of a mouthful. Let's begin with the title. Where and before whom assizes shall be taken. So what does this word assizes mean? So the term assizes comes from the Old French, meaning sittings or sessions. It refers to periodic court sessions held in medieval England and parts of Europe. These courts were responsible for administering justice, particularly in serious criminal cases and civil disputes involving land. The word comes from the Latin assidere, meaning to sit beside, referring to judges sitting in judgment. In this context, in the 12th and 13th centuries, assizes referred to legal codes and regulations issued by the kings or nobles. It could also mean a ruling or ordinance established by a feudal lord. From the 12th century onward, assizes referred to the traveling courts, where royal justices would go from town to town to hear cases. These courts dealt with, again, serious crimes such as murder, robbery, and treason, as well as land disputes. So, where and before whom assizes shall be taken. Similar to our previous conversation about the common pleas, we're in essence dealing with the topic of the King's Court, of our relationship to it, perhaps. So in this context, assizes refers to specific types of legal actions, not of the traveling court. The title is addressing the procedure for hearing certain legal disputes. So, in the first sentence, assizes of novel disseisin and of mortencester shall not be taken but in the shires and after this manner. So what is novel disseisin? Novel disseisin are cases where someone was wrongfully dispossessed of land. Mort d'ancestor is a case where an heir claimed their inheritance was wrongly denied. So assizes of novel disseisin and of mort d'ancestor shall not be taken but in the shires and after this manner, which we'll get into. But the shires are specific locations. They are locales, equivalent to counties in our tongue. or an administrative district. So again, keeping in mind the definition of these two things, the novel decides on cases where someone was wrongfully dispossessed of land. I think of arbitrary authority here. Mort ancestor, cases where an heir claimed their inheritance was wrongly denied. Address of grievance. Here's a common plea. So we are restricting these disputes to an intimate location, a close local location. So the first subclause here, if we be out of this realm, our chief justicer shall send our justicers through every county once in the year, which with the knights of the shires shall take the said assizes in those counties. So a comment on the distribution of the judiciary. If we be out of this realm, so if that principal authority, it's kind of difficult to understand exactly what it means by we, and by we I just sort of have to imagine that particular aspect of the baronial class that has some judicial responsibilities. But upon further research, I actually think that this the we refers to the monarch. It refers to King John himself. He's speaking as the embodiment of the state and of the realm, even though this clause in the Magna Carta itself is written by the king's barons and the clergy. It is issued in the king's name. And the language here reflects that. So the verse, or the clause prior, also I think should be interpreted in that manner. So, what are we to say about this first subclause? If the king is out of the realm, it is saying that the chief justicer, the person that is under the king that is responsible for hearing these important cases, that they are obligated to travel through every county once a year. And the knights of the shires, they take the assizes in those counties, they hear them. So they are obligated not necessarily to travel where they please, and the inhabitants of the shires go to them. They are obligated once a year to go to each and every county to hear these cases on the part of the commons. The second subclause reads, and those things that at the coming of our foresaid justicers being sent to take those assizes in the counties cannot be determined, shall be ended by them in some other place in their circuit. So here we have the image of an itinerant judge that is obligated to a locale once a year going through these counties. What is being said here, in other words, is that if a situation just cannot be resolved by the complexity of the case, that given this justicer's trajectory, their route, almost like a mailman, they can carry this dispute to the next circuit as they hear new cases and so forth, and decide on it then. So it doesn't create this backlog or perhaps arbitrary conclusion or premature conclusion of some case. It doesn't necessarily mean that when the cases cannot be determined, that it goes to a higher court. It's just continued on. So the third subclause, and those things which for difficulty of some articles cannot be determined by them shall be referred to our justicers of the bench, and there shall be ended. Now this third subclause, I think, does refer to a higher court. So it's saying, for further difficulties, the articles, they cannot be decided upon. The justicers of the bench refers to a specific court. And that specific court is the Court of Common Pleas, which is established in the prior clause, or the King's Bench at Westminster. So to close this out, what can be said of the broader clause? What is the purpose of this? So there is some establishment, and the cases that are mentioned here are not trivial. What they wish to prevent are certain abuses, arbitrary abuses regarding land and inheritance. In order to do this, there must be some regular form of hearing complaints, of hearing pleas. And so I think that clause does, in effect, is establish that regularity for unforeseen circumstances for which the king is out of the realm and unable to adjudicate, to provide some regular account and institutional backing of law. If something cannot be decided, then it continues with the justicer on to their next place. And if ultimately it is not decided on, then it is elevated to the next level of the court. And so there is this stratified apparatus, legal apparatus, that is being formed, that the higher courts are responsible for more difficult cases, for cases that are philosophically perhaps more dense, and maybe cases that aren't as easily or readily apparent, not as readily solvable. So I think I'm going to end this episode here, and I'll continue next time with Clause 13.